So next week should be a really fun time. Next week we have the opportunity to participate in our first ever Show Us Your Socks Sunday. And as we've already articulated, the reason why we're participating in Show Us Your Socks is to bring awareness to those who are living with developmental disabilities, but to also show our support for those who are living with developmental disabilities. And we're also doing it so that as a congregation we can participate together in raising funds for Ridge Area ARC, which is our local nonprofit that focuses on providing a full, complete life to those in our community, our sisters and our brothers who are our neighbors, who are living with developmental disabilities. And one of the reasons why we do this is very simple. God calls us, Jesus calls us to love our neighbors, and the residents and the members of ARC are indeed our neighbors. Each and every one of them is a full and a unique individual. They are the folks who are growing vegetables in our garden of hope. They are the people who are volunteering at the Shepherd's Pantry, who are passing out self-care items to our customers. They are the artists who all last month have been exhibiting their artwork at the Peter Pollard Museum in Avon Park. But more than that, the consumers, the residents, the people of ARC are funny. They are Romeos. They are Valentine's Day pageant queens. They are introverts and they are extroverts. They are horse riders and they are employees of local establishments. They are Mountain Dew drinkers. And next week they are going to be here worshiping alongside us. And how awesome. How awesome that we as Emmanuel United Church of Christ have grown to the point that we understand that the gospel of Jesus Christ empowers us to do things like not only recognize our veterans and not only recognize women, but to recognize people from Haiti and Cuba and Canada and the Philippines, to recognize our LGBTQ neighbors. Not only that, because of our understanding of the gospel of Jesus Christ, we are also a church that sets aside time once a year to remember parents who have lost children, to honor mothers, to honor fathers. And now we have this amazing opportunity next week to honor and to celebrate and to welcome those who are living with developmental disabilities. And think about it, because I'm only 54, but I remember growing up at a time in which people who were living with developmental disabilities were hidden away. They were seen as a secret, or someone to be ashamed of, or someone who was not worthy of proper care. And yet, we know that people living with developmental disabilities are children of God. And as children of God, not only are they worthy of our love, but they are indeed our neighbors. Love. That is the theme of today's scripture. And thank God, because it feels like love is what we need. And we're not just talking about mushy love. We're not just talking about romantic love. But we're talking about the kind of love that Jesus talks about. Jesus in today's reading talks about love of God and love of neighbor. And if you've noticed, we've been following the whole experience of Jesus for this entire season. And hopefully you have realized that when Jesus talks about love your neighbor, Jesus is not being ignorant, nor does Jesus have an unrealistic view of who his neighbor is. When Jesus says, love your neighbor, Jesus knows exactly who our neighbors are. Remember weeks ago we had that story about the men who tore apart the roof to lower their friend to be healed? And then we discussed the reality that that could have very well been Jesus' very own home. So what that means is when Jesus says love your neighbor, he's saying that with the knowledge that our neighbors could be messy. Jesus says love your neighbor, and according to the Gospel of Mark, he has walked over 3,000 miles in his ministry. So think of all the different kinds of neighbors that Jesus has met. Jesus says love your neighbor, and he is referring to those who appear to be demon-possessed, as well as those who are laying in their sickbed. Jesus says love your neighbor, and he's referring to those who are fishing on the water, those who are mending their nets on the shore, and those who are working in the orchards and the vineyards and the fields. Jesus says love your neighbor, and we must remember that Jesus met a deranged man in a graveyard. He met a non-Jewish family. He met a woman who was destitute and who had been bleeding out for years, and he had met a young girl who was considered dead. Jesus says, love your neighbor, and we have to recall that he was rejected by his very own neighbors in his town, that he was doubted by his very own disciples. Jesus says, love your neighbor, and he had all these issues with the political and religious leaders of his day. So Jesus is not ignorant. Jesus is not unaware of the world. Jesus is fully aware of the world, and he's fully aware of who our neighbors are. And so, according to Jesus, regardless if our neighbor is that cranky old guy Frank that we talked about last week who lives in our neighborhood and chases all the kids away, or if our neighbor is a kid who's constantly in crisis causing trouble, Jesus is saying, love your neighbor as yourself. But then the next question is, what is love? And what does love look like? And this week, unfortunately, I had the experience to hear stories about what love looks like. And I say unfortunately because it was stories that was related to our beloved Carol. And one of the stories I heard about Carol is that she was such an artistic woman, gifted so visually, that she would do things like find a wreath at Marshall's, and even though it looked perfect, she would bring it home and she would decorate it even more. Heard a story from Carol's son that he shared, that one year when he was 15 years old, it was his job to pick out the family Christmas tree. And since he was 15 years old, and we have to forgive him, he thought it would be funny not to go to the regular Christmas tree lot, but to go to the place where the trees were discarded. And Carol's son picked the sickliest, skinniest, most Charlie Brown looking Christmas tree you could ever imagine. And he had the audacity to bring that skinny, sickly, thin Charlie Brown Christmas tree home to his mother and lie to her face and say that was the only tree they had left. And you know what Carol did? She obviously had her questions and she had her doubts. But she went ahead and she actually decorated that skinny, sickly Charlie Brown Christmas tree. She took something that looked so unwell, and she was able to fill it with lights and color and beauty and class. And when she was done, she took that tree that started off as nothing and placed it in the living room, and it looked absolutely beautiful. But then she turned to her son and she said, "Now we're going to go and get a real tree. See, it turns out Carol knew all along exactly what her 15-year-old son was going to do. But she chose to respond in love. You know, Carol could have responded in anger. She could have responded with harsh discipline. She could have expressed intense disappointment, but instead she took what her son offered her and she made it absolutely beautiful and stunning. And to this day, out of all the Christmas trees they've had, that is perhaps the one they remember more than all. This amazing Christmas tree that was decorated and made out of pure love. Love. Jesus says, love God and love your neighbor. And that is essentially the entire gospel. But then we have to ask ourselves again, but what is love? And how is it that we can show love to our neighbor when perhaps our neighbors express and experience love in different ways? You know, I have been so blessed to live in all the different places I've lived, and so blessed to look over my life at all the different people I've encountered, to think about all the different ways that our neighbors show love, and all the different ways we show love in return. I think of growing up on Long Island, and a dear friend named Rosa, whose mother was from Sicily, and the way her mom showed love to us is anytime we came over to the house, her mom would cook for us, even if it was 2 o'clock in the morning. I learned how important it was to receive that love and to show that love in return by not only eating her food, but by asking for seconds. With Carnegie, we have learned that one of the ways we can show love to her and someone from Haiti is to acknowledge that May 18th is Haitian Flag Day. Another thing we have learned from Carnegie is that people from Haiti are so proud of their rice that if they love you, they are going to serve you their rice. And if you love them in return, not only are you going to eat the rice, you are going to say, that is the best rice you have ever had in your entire life. Someone from Colombia, if they want to show you their love, they offer you a cup of Colombian coffee. And if you want to show your love in return, you do not add milk, you do not add sugar, and no matter how hot it is, no matter how strong it is, you drink that coffee and you smile the whole entire time. Germans, you want to show love to a German? Be on time and honor their traditions and their history. English and Jamaicans, how do they show their love? Through a cup of tea. If you are ever invited to an English or Jamaican person and they offer you tea, what they are saying is, I love you. Our veterans, so easy to show our love to our veterans. You simply say, thank you for serving our country. For those who are elderly, one of the greatest ways we can show love is that in public, not to zoom around them or through them or across them, but to go the same pace that they go at. Now, the next two ones are very special to my heart. Introverts. How do you show love to someone who's an introvert, especially if you are married to them or dating them? You learn to be quiet, and you also learn that staying inside to watch a movie could be an amazing expression of love. But if you are dating or married to an extrovert, you are going to have to learn that sometimes you have to go to that loud, obnoxious, wild party, and if you're not willing to allow that person to go by themselves and to not be upset. Another form of love, if you have a grandchild or a niece or a nephew who loves Legos or comic books or Dungeons and Dragons, take them to a store that sells all of those things and let them just go. And sit somewhere for an hour or two and just enjoy watching them as they are experiencing their own version of heaven. 2 more ways of expressing love. One, which we have discovered over the past few months, is trying to learn just a little bit of Spanish and saying that to people in our community who clearly speak Spanish is an amazing sign of love. But here's also something that is so, so, so important. If you meet a person of color, say their name correctly and don't try to give them a nickname. The best way to show love to someone with a unique sounding name is to learn how to say their name that their mom or their aunt or their grandmother decided to give them. Love. Such an important lesson for all of us to understand. And the list continues to go on and on and on and on to show our neighbors how we love them. And you know, it often is so easy, and it rarely costs anything to do. Jesus does such an amazing thing today. Right here in today's reading, he is asked a very complicated question, and he responds with the simplest and the most easiest of answers. Love. Love God, love your neighbor. Because when we do, and when we love God, when we love those who are around us, heaven is one step closer, and the gospel becomes that much clearer. Love. Love God, love your neighbor. That is essentially the entire gospel summed up in just 5 words. Carol Klein embodied that love. Next week, when we come to church in our most colorful, wild socks, that will be another way we are able to embody love. Thank God and thank Jesus that we are people who are called to love, and that the love that God gives us is unlimited. And for that, let us say,